I have concrete, definitive proof that the Romans did not and could not have created the trilithon or any of the Baalbek stones for that matter. I'm Evan Flay, and if this is your first time here, you can get caught up on all the rest of the Giza project videos in a playlist in my channel. But for right now, we're going to get into this. So right now, it's about 5,000 BC or so, and we're following the same group of people, same line, just at a different phase in their progress. Now, with this group, we've seen them start off by addressing the issue of stability at Göbekli Tepe. We saw them then progress to verticality at Jericho. And at that point, you kind of reach a limit on what you can do without at least some form of infrastructure. Because if we are to believe that these were hunter-gatherers, your priority as a hunter-gatherer is pretty simple. It's find food, find shelter, find protection. All right, and if those are your priorities, you cannot be sacrificing large swaths of your workforce to build these great big things. So at Byblos, we see just that. We see them root themselves into one location and build from the inside out. And once they'd established that grasp on logistics and infrastructure, they could then afford to send out engineers, architects, builders, and attempt something on even larger scales. And in this case, they would be looking at mass. And when it comes to improving on mass, they would have gone inland. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, is about 40 to 50 miles inland from Byblos in the Baikal Valley in the modern day city of Baalbek in Lebanon. Now, Baalbek is amazing. There's some of the most amazing stone monoliths and megaliths there. You have the trilithon or the trilithon stones, which are 3 800-ton limestone blocks that have been lifted about 20 feet in the air, cut with millimeter precision to the point where, I mean, they didn't even use mortar. They didn't use any bonding agent. They just placed them with such precision that even today, it's still pretty difficult to find where the joints are. And when you do find one, you can't even fit like a credit card between them. That's how precise they are. But what often gets overlooked is the stones that sit underneath those three things. And also, really quickly, because it's kind of easy sometimes to gloss over the fact, like 800 tons. 800 tons is the weight of two fully loaded 747s in a block that is 60 feet long, 14 feet high, 12 feet wide. That's insane, even by today's standards. But underneath those three blocks, you have about 24 other blocks that are 350 tons. A measly 350 tons. And that's what we're going to be sort of exploring today. And it gets a little tricky because if you ask a historian or an academic, someone who embraces the mainstream narrative, they'll tell you that the Romans did all of it. The Romans built every piece of megalithic and monolithic ancient stone structure in Baalbek. And what makes it a little bit trickier is that we know the Romans were there. They took over Baalbek around 27 BC under the Emperor Augustus. And so things like the temples and the colonnades, the courtyards, the Roman podium, no one disputes that Rome is responsible for those. But to say that they built all of the stuff below that, literally, is short-sighted at best. And we're going to get into why. So, first of all, I don't think there's another culture in human history that loved themselves, but also everything that they did more than the Romans. They logged everything. They went over the top with celebrating certain things. They attributed certain accomplishments to the gods. The largest thing that we know for a fact that they moved was a 300-ton obelisk from Egypt. All right, and they referred to that as a miracle. They called that a miracle. And I mean, realistically speaking, that is unbelievable that they were able to do that. But that's 300 tons. They also said that it took the entire Roman Empire. Now, obviously, that's a metaphor, but that's how they viewed that accomplishment. A 300-ton obelisk that they didn't even quarry. It was quarried most likely from Aswan in Egypt, about 400 or 500 miles south of Giza. It was quarried from Aswan and cut and shaped by the Egyptians, and then thousands of years later, the Romans transported it across the Mediterranean, or up the Nile, well, down the Nile, and then across the Mediterranean, and that's what we have records of. All right, in all the architectural manuals, in all the stories and all the literature, they talked about that endlessly. There's nothing about Baalbek. There is nothing about 24 350-ton stones. There's nothing about 800-ton stones. So right there, everything sort of falls apart. But the real smoking gun here is not necessarily what the Romans didn't say, but what we can see on the stones themselves. Because if you look at the western retaining wall, which is where the trilithon is located, you see the trilithon stones, and then the 24 350-ton blocks below it. And then you also see the newer, smaller Roman stones on top of the trilithon. The weathering and the erosion that's present on the trilithon stones and everything below it is vastly different from the newer Roman stones. Heck, the Roman stones look new compared to everything below it. So if we're to believe that the Romans built all of it, you would expect at least a semblance of consistency when it comes to erosion levels. But not only that, the sheer amount of weathering and erosion on some of the lower stones is profoundly greater than anything that wind and rain could do in 2,000 years. Those stones, the trilithon stones and the smaller 350-ton blocks, were already ancient by the time the first Roman ever stepped foot in modern-day Baalbek. That is indisputable. But let's play devil's advocate. Let's say that the Romans did build these things. Then the question becomes, how? Because we know that they documented everything. All right, they wrote about it in manuals, and they left detailed reports of everything that they did. So right out the gate, one of the common methods that some people bring up is the use of cranes. And I always get the name wrong. I think it's the Roman crane is the polyspaston, something like that. Really, really cool looking piece of equipment, but its maximum lifting capacity was around 6 tons, which, again, is incredible. 12,000 pounds 2,000 years ago, that's insane. But for the sake of what we're talking about, even if you were somehow able to put 100 of these things around one of these blocks, which you wouldn't be able to, you'd still be over 400,000 pounds short, right? So that doesn't work. Then the more common explanation for how they transported these things was wooden rollers or wooden sleds, because the quarry that they were extracted from is actually uphill from the Baalbek complex, so that makes it a little bit easier. Here's the thing though. When it comes to whether it's rollers or sleds, you can't get around the fact that you have to use wood. And the only wood that really would have been available for them to use at the time would be Lebanese cedar. But you couldn't use any Lebanese cedar. You had to use old growth, mature, dry Lebanese cedar. And if it was 2 feet in diameter, that's probably a little bit too small. If it's 4 feet in diameter, there's probably, I mean, that's pretty rare for Lebanese cedar trees, so you probably wouldn't be able to find enough of them. So let's say that it was a happy medium, that they used Lebanese cedar logs that were 3 feet in diameter. And for the sake of this, let's say that they were all perfectly symmetrical, okay? So when it comes to using Lebanese cedar, it's important. Let's look at the dimensions of these blocks. Like I said before, about maybe a little over 61 feet long for the trilithon stones. 61 feet long, 14 feet high, 10 feet wide, with a 3-foot Lebanese cedar log means you can get about 20 of these logs underneath, okay? So we have 20 of these logs. Now, we know that the crushing capacity, the crushing threshold, the limit of Lebanese cedar is 6,000 psi, give or take. Now, that's a lot. It's 6,000 psi, but only when you are running parallel to the grain. And what that means, think of it like this. If you took a chainsaw to a tree and you cut it down and basically left a stump that was 3 or 4 feet high, flat on the top, you could put a tremendous amount of weight. You could put something that exerted 5,500 psi on top of that stump and you'd be fine, because you're running with the grain, because the grain runs up and down the tree. However, the moment you put that log on its side, whether it's a roller where the log is going along the length of them, or if you're actually rolling it and putting them perpendicular to the stone, that crushing limit becomes substantially less. Specifically, 300 to 600 psi. Okay, so now we know that there's no way to create a roller where you are running parallel to the grain. So the 6,000 psi number is out the window. So we have, let's say, a maximum of 20 of these logs underneath one of the 800-ton trilithon stones. Just because a log has a diameter of 3 feet doesn't mean, obviously, that there's 3 feet of contact from stone to log, obviously, because the logs are rounded. In fact, the contact strip per log is about 1/10 to 1/4 of an inch. It's extremely small. Now, when it experiences incomprehensibly large loads, it dents a little bit, but that doesn't help because the dent then starts to split the wood. Okay, so we have about 1/10 of an inch of contact for each of these 20 logs. Now, with a stone that weighs in excess of 1.6 million pounds, the PSI exerted on each of those logs, given all of these dimensions, is 5,000 to 6,000 PSI. So we're looking at 10 to 20 times the amount of force needed to basically start splitting and crushing these logs. So at 300 to 600 PSI, these logs start to fail and rupture. What do you think happens when you add 20 times the stress? The log is going to explode before the stone ever moves an inch. That's just physics. And again, there's zero evidence at the site. There's zero documentation that links Rome to any of these megaliths in Baalbek. And as I said before, the largest thing they ever were involved with even just transporting was 300 tons. 300 tons. But for the real builders, whoever they may be, and we're on the trail figuring out who these people were, for the real builders, the trilithon stones weren't even in their top 3. Because in the nearby quarry, where the stones for the Baalbek complex were extracted, there are still unfinished monoliths, giant blocks, giant pillars that had their excavation interrupted for some reason. But they clearly had a plan. They quarried them, they cut them. They just hadn't gotten around to extracting and moving and placing them yet. And these stones make the trilithon look silly. So specifically, you have the stone of the pregnant woman. That's about 1,000 tons. And then you have the stone of the south. That's around 1,250 tons. And then finally, you have the forgotten stone, and that's in the neighborhood of 1,650 tons. That's over 3 million pounds. 3 million pounds. Don't you think the Romans would have said something about that? I do. It wasn't the Romans. And hey, really quickly, if you want to stay up to date on all the latest developments when it comes to ancient history, yeah, I think you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. All right, let's get back to it. So now that we know that it wasn't the Romans, we can also explore another question, which is, why build this? Why? Well, if we look at where we are in the timeline, this is around the period where civilization is really starting to explode worldwide. It's starting to explode worldwide, and there are greater threats from fellow men, and there are also more ideologies and belief systems and gods and religious, or the origins of religion are beginning to bloom. And so if you are a civilization that wants to remain, that wants to persevere and push through, you adopt permanence through mass, right? You build something that is designed to survive not just the acts of men, so destruction and conquering and attacks, but also designed to survive the acts of the gods. Earthquakes, because we know that that region is extremely seismically active. Fires, windstorms, floods, all things that this group of people may have experienced in the past. And you do that by building something that, in your estimation, can never be moved. So now we've gone from stability at Göbekli Tepe to verticality at Jericho to logistics and infrastructure at Byblos, and now to mass at Baalbek. So by now, this was not a just random ragtag roaming group of hunter-gatherers. This was a full-on population. This was a civilization. And as I said before, we've reached an era where a more familiar timeline is beginning to emerge on the horizon. Because at around 4,000 to 3,000 BC, this group would be expanding. And one of the places that they would reach first would be the Nile Valley. And that's what we're going to explore next, is Old Kingdom Egypt, the 3rd and 4th dynasties, and how the presence of things like silver and antimony played such a big role in telling us who they associated themselves with, who they communicated and traded with, and why that matters for this technical lineage. We're going to look at Heliopolis, which was also known as the Pillar City. And we're going to see how all of this comes together. Thanks so much for watching.